So I've never liked the original story of the loaves and fishes. My rationally trained brain could not find meaning in food appearing like magic. My finely honed Unitarian Universalist skepticism could not understand how this kind of biblical miracle could be applicable to our lives. Even later in my life, when I began to redefine miracles as ordinary glimpses into the sacredness of life, the loaves and fishes was not a miracle I could get to fit into this new paradigm. But when I first heard that second version that Sadie shared with us today, I finally connected with it. To imagine this miracle as a miracle of sharing was a powerful shift in my understanding of the story. The way I first heard it began as the original did, with the disciples being pretty sure that there wasn't enough for everyone. And then as the disciples started passing around their meager 5 loaves and 2 fish, the gathered crowd began pulling out the couple of loaves that they had brought for themselves and adding them to the communal pile, made confident that they would get what they needed by the generosity of others. Now, this was a miracle that I could wrap my head around. And it was so profoundly relates to the ways abundance and scarcity work in our own society, or could work if we could embrace the generosity of spirit exhibited in this story. So you probably know that we live in a culture of scarcity and competition. Our culture interprets our world in the way that those disciples did at the beginning of the story when they looked at the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looked at the 5,000 people and said, that's not enough to go around. When I talk about our culture of scarcity, there's definitely a big part of it that's about resources and money, but we have just as much of a culture of scarcity in less tangible ways. We imagine our world to be scarce in things like power and status and worth, as well as even less tangible things like truth and love. This perception of scarcity has many roots. It comes theologically from the Puritan heritage that I touched on last week, the notion that even salvation is limited and scarce. It comes historically from the Enlightenment's focus on the individual and on defending our personal rights. It comes societally from the notion of the American dream, which Harry just sang about. This dream which offers us both a vision of abundance and tells us that we don't have enough. And it comes, perhaps most of all, from our economic system of capitalism, which literally places economic value on scarcity and insists that competition is a necessary part of our economy. The fundamental problem with all 4 of these mindsets is that they make the claim that abundance is desirable for all of us, but only available to some of us. We can have abundance as individuals, but only if we do not all live in abundance. Capitalism in particular declares that if there were enough of any given thing to go around, it would no longer be valuable. The value of a resource is directly tied to how scarce it is. And so therefore, we must be in competition for resources at all times. In our society, abundance is a privilege, not a right, and needs to be hoarded at all costs. Abundance is something we have as individuals, while scarcity is the pervasive reality of this world that we live in. As theologian Sally McFaig writes, the current dominant American worldview, a legacy from the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, and 18th century economics, is that we are individuals with the right to happiness, especially the happiness of the consumer-style abundant life. The market ideology has become our way of life, almost our religion, telling us who we are, consumers, and what is the goal of life, making money. The grim results of this lifestyle, she says, are becoming apparent. We see these grim results play out every day. In this culture of scarcity, we see wealth concentrated in the hands of a few individuals, while our child poverty rate here in the United States is the highest of any developed country. In this culture of scarcity, the United States has the best hospitals in the world, but large swaths of the country can't afford to use them. In this culture of scarcity, we build walls to keep out immigrants and find excuses to deport immigrants who are already here for fear that they will take our jobs. In this culture of scarcity, we assume that making the statement Black Lives Matter means that somehow other lives matter less, that somehow even the quantity of mattering in this world is limited. In this culture of scarcity, we move to New Hampshire so that we don't have to pay taxes and forget to wonder about the impact of that lack of income for the government until there is some service that we encounter that we personally need that doesn't exist. And most of all, in this culture of scarcity, we live in a constant state of fear and separation. When we assume that there are not enough resources, power, even worth to go around, we live with the fear that I personally, will not have enough. When we are forced to compete to get our basic needs met, we cannot help but feel separate and apart from one another. You see this played out as a grotesque parody in the sci-fi trilogy, The Hunger Games. The premise is a world in which children are forced to fight each other to the death in order to win some extra food for the people in their area of the country. As soon as the children get into the arena where the competition happens, they live in constant fear of one another, in constant battle for survival, and for the hope of feeding their people. It is a premise that's so hard for us to even think about because it seems so immoral. But the real power of the Hunger Games is not really about the horrors of this world that author Suzanne Collins creates. The real power is what happens when the children decide not to go along with the plan. When they decide that sharing is an option, that they don't have to play by the rules of the game, they are able to, in the end, overthrow the game altogether. Katniss, the main character, and her crew simply say no to the idea that there could be only one winner, to the idea that there is not enough to go around. And in doing so, they also say no to fear of one another and to the isolation of not knowing who you can trust. As is so often the case with science fiction, The Hunger Games uses a dystopian world and a premise that seems absurd to us to illustrate something important about our own world. It is a parody of our own culture of scarcity, a parody of capitalism's effect on us, a parody of the competition, isolation, and fear that exist in our own world that we encounter every day. The story shows us what could happen if the patterns of our world were taken to an extreme. It is a horrendous picture of what our future could be. At the same time, Katniss and those she gathers around her show us another way of being. They point toward the path of resistance, showing us how to get out of a future that we certainly don't want to be a part of. It's a path that requires two kinds of faith. First, faith in our fellow human beings. Faith that underneath it all, we intrinsically care about one another and not just about our own personal survival. Second is faith in the abundance of this world. Faith that there is actually enough here to take care of everyone's basic needs. These are two kinds of faith that our society has sought to deny in so many ways over the years. And they are two kinds of faith that Unitarian Universalism has nonetheless continued to promote: faith in humanity and faith in the abundance of this world. We've spoken about these two kinds of faith many times in this space. When I look at the culture of scarcity we live in, when I see the people who are harmed by this notion that we do not have enough to go around, it seems to me that what this world needs is a whole lot more of each of these two kinds of faith. Quaker educator Parker Palmer writes, "The quality of our active lives depends heavily on whether we'd assume a world of scarcity or a world of abundance. Do we inhabit a universe where the basic things that people need, from food and shelter to a sense of competence and being loved, are ample in nature?" he asks. Or is this a universe where such goods are in short supply, available only to those who have the power to beat everyone else to the store? The nature of our action will be heavily conditioned by the way we answer those bedrock questions. In a universe of scarcity, only people who know the arts of competing, even of making war, will be able to survive. But in a universe of abundance, acts of generosity and community become not only possible, but fruitful as well. In the story of the loaves and the fishes, the disciples get over their fear that there will not be enough because Jesus models for them a mindset of abundance. And in witnessing their generosity, the crowd, the others in the crowd, are moved to generosity as well. In the story of the Hunger Games, Katniss throws out the idea that there need only be one winner. And in doing so, she attracts a whole community, a whole movement of people who eventually actually do change the world. In our story, a story of a culture of scarcity, we need to start by changing the narrative. We need to get over our fear that there may not be enough for everyone. We need to throw out the idea that there can be only one winner or even only a handful of winners. We need to stop telling this story of scarcity and start telling a story of abundance. Now, our story of abundance is not a privileged story of abundance. It's not about my individual blessings, my individual experience of abundance. It is a story of our collective abundance. It is a story of the kind of abundance that comes when we trust that there is enough for all, when we are able to put aside our fear and really care for one another. It's a story that places value on relationships and community rather than on money and possessions. Above all else, it is a story of faith. It is a story of faith in humanity and faith in the abundance of our world. It is a story that Unitarian Universalists have been telling for years. And it's a story that our world desperately needs. In a world controlled by scarcity and fear, we need to tell a new story of abundance so that we might begin together to build a new way. And in that spirit, I invite you to join in our closing hymn called Building a New Way. It's number 1017 in the Teal hymnal.